All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jorgen Rose with Practical Farmers of Iowa. Thank you for tuning in on this Friday afternoon for this virtual field day and prairie walk. By some estimates, the tallgrass prairies that covered as much as 80% of Iowa prior to European settlement were composed of more than 500 species of grasses and forbs or wildflowers. And that's a lot of species. Today's prairies reconstructions and even the few remnants remaining on the landscape rarely play host to that sort of plant diversity, but there's still a lot of plants out there to learn and know and recognize. And so we're broadcasting live today from Snyder Heritage Farm. This property is owned and managed by the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, and we are lucky today to have Land Stewardship Director Ryan Schmidt with us to show us around the prairie. And we'll hear more from Ryan and let him introduce himself and the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation in more detail in just a minute. But I want to say thank you up front for his willingness to play virtual host this afternoon. So before we get to the good stuff, I do have to do a few acknowledgements and take care of some housekeeping. So first, I want to thank our organizational partners for this event, Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa, who we've been partnering with on this Botany Beginners course. And of course, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation for hosting us here today and sharing their expertise. So I'm going to put web links for both those organizations into the chat as soon as I'm done with my introduction here. If you're interested in learning more about native habitat, tallgrass prairie, land protection, land stewardship, restoration, any of those topics, I would highly recommend that you check out both of these organizations' websites. I also want to acknowledge that this work is funded by a Conservation Innovation Grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So here's my contractually required disclaimer for your reading pleasure. And then I also want to make sure that I thank all of our sponsors for these events. So we could not put on these virtual field days free of charge and open to the public without support from all our great sponsors. So here are A-level sponsors. I want to thank them for supporting over 60 virtual field days this season. And then I also want to make sure that I thank our B-level sponsors. Again, without the support of our sponsors, we couldn't do events like this one. So just a little bit about Practical Farmers of Iowa. PFI is a farmer member organization, which means that our farmers and our members set our priorities and point us where they want to go. And so we achieve our mission of equipping farmers to build resilient farms and communities in many ways, primarily through on-farm research and by empowering farmers and landowners to connect and share knowledge. So virtual field days like this one are just one of the many ways that we work to make connections, share knowledge, and build community. And you can learn more about the many other great things we do, and you can learn more about becoming a PFI member and all those associated benefits on our website, practicalfarmers.org. So just a little bit of housekeeping here for our agenda. Very shortly, I'm going to turn things over to Ryan, and we'll plan on wrapping up around 4:30 or so. So this will be a short event. We will try and have some time at the end for questions, but we will also take clarifying questions throughout. So if you have a question that comes up, feel free to type it into the Facebook chat and we can relay those to Ryan so he can answer them live. If there are bigger questions that come up, feel free to also type those into the chat as well, but we'll probably hold on to them until there's a break or until the end, and then we'll have him answer those. So if you chat a question and we don't get to it right away, we haven't forgotten about you. We'll try and get to all the questions as time allows. And then finally, I'm going to also be pasting a link to a field day evaluation in the chat box. So please click that link and tell us what you thought about this virtual event. We really value that input. We rely on those evaluations to make all our events better. So please take a couple minutes and fill out that survey. And so with that, I am going to turn things over to Ryan. There we go, Ryan, you're on.
Awesome, ready to go. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Ryan Schmidt, Land Stewardship Director with Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is a nonprofit land conservation organization based in Des Moines, but we work on a statewide level to protect and restore Iowa's land, water, and wildlife. My job focuses on land restoration, land stewardship, so doing things like prescribed fire, invasive species removal, prairie reconstruction, and other things like that on the land. I'd like to welcome you to Snyder Heritage Farm. Snyder Heritage Farm is a 154 acre natural area here in Polk County. This is a beautiful natural area that features oak, hickory savanna, pothole wetlands, and also, of course, prairie reconstruction. So Really neat place out here that I'm excited to share with you a little bit here. My goal for the day is just to do a casual walk through the prairie, talk about some of the wildflowers that are blooming here in late July, and then also talk a little bit about stewardship of native prairies, what we do out here to take care of these prairies and ensure that our plant and animal diversity is doing the best it can out here. So like Jorgen said, I would certainly encourage questions while I'm talking and walking through the prairie. Be happy to answer any questions. So we'll start walking here and take a look at a couple wildflowers. I want to start with a species that might be pretty common to a lot of people, and this is common milkweed. So pretty commonly seen out on the land, and especially in an agricultural setting. Common milkweeds are just that. You see them quite a bit. Some of the identifying factors of these, of course, they're done blooming by now. You can see the pods starting to form already here, and I'm sure many people are familiar with the seed pods of milkweed. But also, if you break the leaf just a little bit, you'll see that white milky sap that is very characteristic of our milkweed species. So neat species, of course, beneficial to pollinators, and of course, you hear a lot about monarchs and their connection with milkweeds. Right next to it here, this is a species called gray-headed coneflower. You may also hear it called yellow coneflower. Fairly commonly seen, you'll see it blooming in the road ditches right now, maybe at the margins of your farm, places like that. But has the characteristic droopy yellow petals. So the petals kind of hang down below the main flowering structure up here. So to me, that one, that's what jumps out on this plant here. So a neat species, wonderful for pollinators as well. Okay, let's keep on moving here. Let's go right over here, Jenna. Cool, so this purple one, also fairly commonly seen in Iowa. This is a species called wild bergamot. You may also hear it called bee balm. It's a July bloomer, and it's actually just starting to finish up its blooming. This is a plant that's in the mint family. So something characteristic of mints are that the stem, if you roll the stem in your fingers there, you'll feel kind of a square shape to the stem. Also, as you might guess with the mints, if you pop a leaf off, smell just a little bit, you'll find just a little bit of a minty smell there too. So lots of wildflowers that are in the family of mints. This is one that we commonly see here in Iowa. Okay. As you can see, the prairie is tall, which is why we call this the tall grass prairie. The grasses have really shot up here in the last couple weeks or so. Really starting to show a lot of vegetative cover and color here in the prairies. I wanted to point this plant out. It's not blooming right now, definitely not very showy, but this is tall thistle. And I know that some of you are sitting there shaking your head thinking, why are we talking about thistles? But Iowa does have several native thistle species. Unfortunately, thistles generally get a bad rap and are generally thought of as negative in Iowa. But these thistles that are native to Iowa are wonderful pollinator plants. You'll see when they start blooming later here in the summer, the butterflies and the bees just absolutely go nuts for thistles. But one of the identifying characteristics here on the top side of the leaf, you can see kind of a darker green color. And if you flip it over to the underside of the leaf, you'll see a whitish or cream colored underside of the leaf. Very different on top versus bottom. You can see that. That is one general identifying factor. Sometimes it's harder to see, but you won't see that on your non-native thistles. So that's one thing I like to use on these native thistles. Generally, you see that white underside of the leaf. Also, this one has yet to bloom. Our non-native thistles generally bloom early June into mid-June, and our native thistles aren't blooming in most cases till July. So if you're seeing those early bloomers, you might be looking at a non-native thistle. If you're seeing it later in July, it very well could be a native thistle. All right, I want to show everybody one more milkweed species. So you may or may not be familiar with Iowa's milkweed species. So we do have more than just common milkweed. We see that one most of the time here. But Iowa does have, I believe, 17 species of milkweeds, and they all are beneficial to pollinators, and all can be used by monarch butterflies as well. But this white flower here, so a white bloomer, very narrow, skinny leaf here. This is called world milkweed, and world comes from the world characteristic is the definition of the leaf structure here. So we have milkweeds that bloom white, pink, purple, orange, all kinds of different colors of milkweed species. Once again, if you break a leaf on this one, just like with the common milkweed, you'll see that white milky sap that's pretty characteristic. Okay, so lots of cool milkweed species in Iowa. Always fun to show off. So let's take a little bit of a walk here. Go to a little bit different part of the prairie. I also wanted to mention this is a prairie reconstruction. So what that means is that this prairie has been recreated from native prairie seed. This was once crop field. See if I can find my way through this prairie jungle here. So this was farmed at one point, and INHF has chosen to put this former crop ground back into native prairie. Of course, there's lots of benefits of native prairie. You know, the plant diversity is absolutely critical for wildlife, insects, pollinators, things like that. So we try to have an incredible wildflower diversity out here, but prairies also do great things like hold soil in place, hold water or filter water, retain water, limit runoff, things like that. So prairies have a host of environmental benefits, which is really cool to see. So Jorgen mentioned that we have upwards of 500 native plants that may have once occurred in Iowa prairies. Out here, we have some pretty good diversity. These prairie reconstructions may contain, you know, 50 to 75 species. If we start getting up to 100, which some of our prairie reconstructions do have that many species, that's pretty good for a prairie reconstruction in Iowa. We're always trying to get bring back as much of that diversity as possible. So here I'm standing next to another plant, kind of got a fun name called rattlesnake master. So if we look down at this one, it's in full bloom right now. You might not guess that. It's not a very showy flower, just kind of a creamy white color, not showy petals, anything like that. Really unique plant in terms of that flower structure, but fairly typical July bloomer. So starting to bloom all over the prairie here. If you look at the leaves on this one, you'll get kind of a waxy feel on the leaf, but also if you look real close, you can see some almost spines or barb-like structures on the edge of the leaf there. Very characteristic of rattlesnake master, and also one of my favorite names of the prairie plants in Iowa. Kind of a fun one. All right.
Ryan, can I ask a question while you're walking?
Yeah, jump in with a question here. You bet.
So we've seen in some other virtual field days and prairie walks, some, you know, prairie reconstructions and prairie strips and CRP plantings that are, you know, 3, 4, 5 years old. Can you tell us how old this reconstruction is?
Right. Yeah. So where we're standing right now, this prairie reconstruction is right around 25 years old. So this one's been here quite a while. Things have progressed a lot in the world of prairie reconstruction in that time, but still, this one has some pretty good uh, species diversity in it for being planted 25 years ago. Out here on this farm, we've kind of phased in the prairie reconstruction. So our youngest prairies are about 10 years old, and then the oldest ones are right around that 25 years. So these prairies are well established here, and showing some really pretty special plant diversity. Great question.
If you get a chance, Ryan, there was a request to take a look at some big blue stem. If you see it while you're walking around.
Very good. Well, let's look at one wildflower while I'm here next to it. This is certainly a more showy flower out here on the prairie. This is called Prairie Blazing Star, and as we're walking around, you'll see lots of them around here. But kind of that showy pinkish purple flower color. It's in full bloom right now. These really pretty narrow, short leaves that kind of follow the stem up to the flower. This flowering head is really short. You can see sometimes these flower structures get much bigger and longer than that, and the whole plant itself will be taller. We're on a pretty dry, poor soil prairie right now, so our blazing stars out here aren't quite as robust as you might see in some higher quality soils. Okay. Had someone maybe interested in seeing some of the grasses too. So of course, there's lots of species of grasses that make up our tall grass prairies. One of the most characteristic grasses in the tall grass prairie is big blue stem. So really within the last couple of weeks, this has shot up the flowering head. So just starting to get going here. You'll hear this species called turkeyfoot sometimes, and if you look at the flowering, which will eventually be the seed head, you can see where it gets that name from. So big blue stem, oftentimes way up above my head. It's one of the tallest grasses in the prairie. So, but grass diversity out here, we have several species of grasses, maybe upwards of 10 to a dozen species of grasses out here. I'm not sure if you guys can see it as I'm walking along, seeing some awesome insects and butterflies. It's amazing that these species find these prairies, and there's no doubt that they're utilizing them. So a pretty special refuge here for some really neat wildlife. Okay.
Ryan, there was another request. This one's a little more specific, but if there's any cut leaf coneflower.
Yeah, so I had a question about cut leaf coneflower. We don't have that species out here. We do have gray-headed coneflower, like I talked about, and then pale purple coneflower, which I believe would be a different species than that cut leaf. Pale purple coneflower, we have plenty of that out here, and it's actually done blooming, but I can see some as I look out across the prairie. It's starting to put its seed head on already. All right, let's look at this purple prairie clover. You can see that we're in just kind of a dense patch of it right here. It seems like the soils right here. This is finishing blooming, but you can still see that really showy color, actually very similar to the prairie blazing star. Really neat species that is a legume. So several species out here are legumes. So you guys may know that legumes are nitrogen fixing. They're putting nitrogen into the soil, which is beneficial not only for crops, but for prairies as well. So we have lots of legume species here that help our prairies. And these flowers are just absolutely showy. But that typical clover leaf on it, and if you ever get a chance to smell this one, absolutely a wonderful smell of that flower. Kind of fun out here. Okay. I would also like to mention too that this prairie was burnt this spring. So I think sometimes it's always surprising to people how quickly these prairies respond and revegetate following a burn. So this would have been burnt late March, I believe. Uh, and you may know that prairie ecosystems thrive with the reintroduction of fire. These plant species evolved with fire. There was naturally occurring fires that happened on the landscape for centuries before we were here. And so to bring back fire through a prescribed fire setting or a controlled burn can really do some wondrous things on these prairies. So fire increases flower production, which leads to better seed production and really stimulates vegetative growth in general. So these in general, most of these plants just they really thrive once we get fire on here. So we burn this every so often just to keep that that fire into the system and help out our native plants. Here's a flower or a plant called round-headed bush clover. So another kind of fun name. All kinds of fun names out here on the with the wildflowers. But this is another legume species. This is actually the flower structure right here. So pretty inconspicuous white cream colored flower. Not the showiest of your wildflowers, but certainly a beneficial species that you see fairly often. You might see it in road ditches or in other places. So some of these species out here can grow pretty easily from seed, and you see them fairly commonly. Other species are really unique out here and are very uncommon or even rare in Iowa. So some of these species, if you're seeing them out on your farm, and if you haven't reseeded or planted those species, could be a sign that you may have a special area on your farm. And because these species just don't occur everywhere now. They've been largely taken out of our state, and so if you see some of these species on your farm, you take an extra look. You might have something pretty special there. All right, let's look at a little bit lower growing flower here. This is called partridge pea. Just started to bloom within the last few days out here. Really, I think a neat leaf structure, just a beautiful plant, and then this just pretty showy and recognizable yellow flower. Generally, these are shorter. They can get up to knee height or up to your thigh, but generally you'll see them down low like this. This is actually another legume species, so kind of a fun one there called partridge pea.
Ryan, can I ask another question here?
Yeah, keep the questions coming.
So there's a question about the big tall plant behind you.
As I'm walking around here, I was hoping you guys may notice that one. So I'm guessing you're talking about the tall yellow blooming wildflower. Just absolutely magnificent and one of our tallest wildflowers. So let's find one here that we can get a little bit close up look of. So this one is called compass plant, and you can see as I'm standing beside it here, well above my head, can get over 10 feet tall. Just an incredible species. Really neat leaf structure. Kind of got an abrasive feel to it. But from what I understand, some of our grazers, cattle, and other species just absolutely love to eat compass plants. So kind of a neat thing there. Gets its name kind of uniquely. I think there was a thought that, the leaves kind of orient themselves to a specific direction. But from what I've seen on our compass plants out here and other places, it's very unreliable. But all the pretty neat that it's got a cool name like compass plant there. Also, this species doesn't bloom every year. We've been just loving the big boom in compass plants this year. We don't really know why it happens, what triggers it. Something environmentally, maybe a host of factors. Last year, you wouldn't have seen, I maybe could have counted on one hand how many compass plants were out here blooming, and this year they're all blooming. So it's been pretty fun to watch them all out here this year.
Ryan, we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
And if we run a little over, I think that'll be good. But I have several questions here about prescribed fire. And so, one question was, how's this prairie maintained? I think you spoke to that. It sounds like fire is kind of your primary management tool. Somebody asked, how often are your burns? Every few years, every 2 or 3 years. And then somebody also asked, how much do you burn at once? So it looks like they've been instructed at some point to kind of break up their burning and vary the burn times in order to provide some refuge. So
so all great questions about fire, and sometimes kind of difficult to answer those questions where we're still learning a lot about fire and what the effects are on our prairie species. But as far as fire frequency, how often do we burn this? That varies. I think the generally accepted time frame is anywhere from every 2 to 4 years. Some of our prairies get burnt more often than that if we have specific goals in mind of stimulating flowering and seed production or suppressing an invasive species. But generally, I would say most of the times we're anywhere in that every 2 years to 4 years time frame that we burn. But that does vary depending on what the goals are. What was one of the other questions there, Jorgen?
Do you break up the prairies, segment them in terms of burn time or burn year to provide refuge?
Yes. So one thing we are very diligent about is not burning all of our prairies at once. So Jorgen mentioned the word refuge. You hear the term refugia. Basically leaving an unburned patch for species to overwinter in and generally thrive in. So I think that's a goal because we just don't know everything about the negative effects of fire. So leaving some unburned patches can help us limit some of those negative effects. If it might be a rare insect, we don't want to have any negative consequences. So we always leave some unburnt out here, and on that's a goal on all of our prairies that INHF takes care of, especially our prairie remnants, which are prairies that have never been plowed, that true native vegetation. Those prairies host some incredible diversity, and we're really cautious to not burn too much and give the prairie a little bit of a break and leave some refugia. Great question.
I have one more fire question, and then I have a grazing question. So someone asked about fall or spring burns, or maybe a growing season burn is a better term than a fall burn. But
Yep. So I mentioned that this was burned in March. Most of our burning does occur from March till early May here in Iowa and at Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. That's generally the best window for weather that's conducive to burning, which is why it's our most popular burn time. But we also know that historically prairies burnt at different times of the year too. So we're trying to incorporate fall burns after the leaves drop and things kind of go dormant in the fall. You'll also hear some talk about late summer burns. They all have different effects on the prairie. They all have their pros and cons. I think one of my main goals here in the work that I do is try to vary that timing of the burn. Don't get caught up in a consistent every 2 years mid-April burn. You'll start to favor some species or suppress other species. So providing variation, some randomness in that burn schedule can help the greatest diversity of plants thrive. So we really try to mix that up. We're learning a lot about what the effects of different burn timings are, but I think generally providing some randomness and changing up the season in which you burn can be a good thing. Mother Nature's not a simple thing. It's not as simple as spring versus fall. There's a lot of complicated factors in there, but incorporating differences in prescribed fire can be a good thing.
Thanks. So we're at time, Ryan, but there's some more questions that I want to answer if we can. But I just want to, in case people have to log off, I want to make sure that I thank everyone for attending, and I'm going to be pasting that link to the field day evaluation into the chat again on Facebook. If you would take a few minutes and fill that out, that would be great. Also, don't forget to visit Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation or the Tallgrass Prairie Center's website for more information on, prairie, land protection, stewardship, restoration. And I also want to encourage everyone to check out Practical Farmers of Iowa's website for more virtual events and field days, including a couple events. I'll post links here as well next week. So there's one on Tuesday related to rare habitats on farms, and then there's another event on Friday talking about prairie strips. So those events might be of interest to people. And as I think I mentioned at the very beginning, if you're interested in learning more about native plants or native plant ID, please check out some of the recorded sessions for the Botany Beginners course that Practical Farmers partnered with Tallgrass Prairie Center to put on, and those can be found on Tallgrass Prairie Center's website. And with that, Ryan, are you good to keep answering a few questions?
Yeah, let's do it. We're out here on the prairie enjoying every minute of this hot day, so let's keep rolling here.
Great. So there was a question about cattle. Are cattle ever allowed to graze on these reconstructed areas?
We at the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation are starting to get into grazing a little bit more. Out here at Snyder Heritage Farm, we do not have any grazing that occurs. And there's a host of challenges or barriers to grazing, thinking about fencing and water and things like that. So we don't have cattle on this farm, but I think in general, grazing is a component that was historically a part of our native prairies. So, we used to have native grazers such as bison on the landscape. Now we don't have that, but we can use what we have today, which is generally cattle. And I think prairies do respond differently to grazing, and there can be some good things that come out of it. But just like with fire, grazing has to be managed properly. And, we have to really pay attention to how much we're grazing, the timing of the grazing, and really be observant of what the effects are. So I do support grazing. I think it can be a good thing on the prairies, but there are some challenges, some barriers, but we're trying to do a little bit more of it because we do see value in bringing grazers back to the landscape.
And then, Ryan, there was a question about chemical drift too. So I know you got some farm fields on the other side of you. Is that something that you deal with either at Snyder or on any other properties? Is I'm assuming herbicide drift, but also maybe some pesticide drift.
Right. Yep. So that is something that we deal with on this farm and other farms. So whether that's ground that Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is currently farming, or if that's a neighbor, it's something that we pay attention to and something I'm very sensitive to. When we have herbicide drift, it can really negatively impact these plants out here. They do not like that. So we pay attention to it. We try to work with our farming tenants or our neighbors to just help them understand some of those consequences and try to encourage them that, we know that herbicide application is part of farming here, but we try to encourage them to just pay attention to it and do it, at times when it's not so breezy, the breeze isn't blowing toward our prairie, things like that. So definitely something we see, definitely something we want to be aware of and try to limit as much as possible.
I have a couple of questions here about, I'm going to bundle them together about controlling invasive species. And this is probably different depending, this reconstruction is pretty well established. The newer ones, this might be more of a problem, I'm not sure. But so specifically calling out Canada thistle and white sweet clover.
Yes, so of course there's a whole list of invasive species that we have out here on our prairies. And this prairie is no exception. Even though this prairie's been here for quite a while and fairly well established, it still takes general maintenance. We walk through these prairies with our staff, our interns, volunteers help us to get rid of invasive species. So you mentioned sweet clover. Generally, we're pulling that out if it's not real thick and kind of scattered across the prairie. We have the people to do that, so we kind of grid walk through the prairie and pull the sweet clover. We also mow sweet clover if it's in dense patches, so mowing can be beneficial if you time it correctly. I won't get into a whole lot of that, but mowing on certain species can also be a good thing. Fire in general can do can have some positive effects on certain native species. So if you time your prescribed burn maybe later in the season or a particular season of the year, you could negatively impact it, which could be a good thing. Also, we do a little bit of herbicide application as well. So some of our perennial, deep-rooted invasive species that we can't pull out and they don't respond well to mowing, we do some spot herbicide application. We really try to limit our herbicide application, but it certainly is, it's something that we do on our prairies, and oftentimes they need it. So it's a matter of what species you have, how much you can tolerate, how much are they taking over your prairie, and that'll kind of guide you and how much you want to try to attack those species.
Thanks, Ryan. There was a question about some other grass IDs. So I know you mentioned there are, 10 or 12 different grass species out there, but maybe you can talk about some of the shorter ones that we're seeing there that might be more common.
Right. Yep. So yeah, you're seeing the tall grasses. I pointed out big blue stem that rises up above the rest of the plants here, but several species underneath here. So some of the shorter growing grasses here, love this species is called little blue stem, and absolutely loves these drier areas. And this is about as tall as it'll get. So if you kind of gets about knee high, this one has yet to flower and produce seed, but a really nice change in the height and the structure of our prairie grasses. We also have another shorter grass in here called Cytodes grama, kind of a fun name, but that one's also a short one, changes the structure up a little bit, and we really do try to put together a seed mix that has a good mix of short versus tall grasses, and maybe heavier on the end of shorter grasses. Some of these taller grasses like Indian grass, this is Indian grass here, another really tall one, and big blue stem. Those species can really, they tend to take over if they're seeded too densely. They're really tall, they take up a lot of room, and they really outcompete some of our shorter grasses and our wildflowers. So we do try to limit some of the taller grasses. So most of our prairies that we plant at Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation have a little bit more on the side of the shorter grasses. But of course we throw in a lot of wildflower seed as well. So when we're thinking about the wildflower and wanting to have diversity, we do try to limit the grasses there too. Grasses are an absolutely critical structural component to our native prairies. You got to have the grasses in there, as well as the wildflowers. But if you want really good wildflower diversity, sometimes the grasses can be a little bit competitive, so you got to keep an eye on that.
Well, thanks, Ryan. It is 4:40, and so just to be respectful of people's time, I think we're going to wrap it up. Do you have any last plant you want to, one last plant you want to show us, or?
Yes, let's look at one more. Yes, so right over here. You knew I was going to take you up on that offer, Jorgen. So let's look at one more right here. So this is called common mountain mint. So really neat white flower in the mint family once again with that square stem. And if you break the leaves off of this and smell it, just incredibly awesome minty smell. So mountain mint is another July bloomer. You'll see it more on moist soil prairies, but up here in this dry prairie, it's also doing okay too. So mountain mint is another fun one that you can see, you know, in the margins of your farm and roadsides, prairie plantings, things like that. So I better stop with looking at prairie plants. I think I could wander around here all afternoon because this is something that I really care a lot about and think it's important to have native prairie species out on our Iowa landscapes. But thanks a lot for tuning into this. This was my first try at a virtual prairie walk, so that was kind of fun for me too. But yeah, feel free to reach out with questions, holler anytime. I love talking about native plants and sharing some of the things that I've learned through my work with native plants and Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thanks for taking the time this afternoon to show us around Snyder Heritage Farm. And I want to give a shout out to Jenna there behind the camera, helping you out. And I just want to say thanks to Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and Tallgrass Prairie Center, and definitely check out their websites for more information and contact information. So with that, I'm going to make one more plug to fill out field day evaluation, and then I will wish everyone a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, everybody.